And hello, folks. Welcome to Totally Tanked. We are with you today on ANZAC Day in Australia. Before we start, given the nature of what we're discussing, I do want to acknowledge that we are recording on the lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay our respects to their elders, past and present. Rob.
Hello. I'm Rob. He's John. We're Totally Tanked, the tankiest podcast in Tankville. And today, John, we're talking about which tank and why today.
Well, this is the Sentinel, Australia's tank. AC-1 for Australian Cruiser 1, or Aussie Cruiser, as it was frequently known.
We're also going to mention the Bob Semple tank and the Schofield tank. Our New Zealand counterparts tanks also built it. And we're celebrating, we're talking about these tanks today because it's ANZAC Day here in Australia, which is the Australian New Zealand Army Corps Day of when they landed in Gallipoli in 1915 and tried very hard.
Yeah.
And sacrificed a lot of people. And then had a very good go at getting out 6 months later. Did a very good job there.
I do want to really get off my chest early. We're going to say some very tough things about the nature of Australia and the Australian nation. And the fact we're doing it on ANZAC Day, I don't want anyone to take as a criticism of our veterans, past and present. We have the utmost respect for everyone who has done their duty for this country. They didn't individually have a choice as to the nature of the country, but we are going to say some things that are maybe going to upset some people. History isn't things that make you feel good.
No.
That's propaganda. So I just want to get that out of the way.
If anybody wants us to hire us to do some propaganda, we're there for it.
But you've got to pay. Yeah, okay. Now, just quickly, and if folks can bear with me on this, I'm going to do a quick potted history of Australia because we do mostly have an international audience. And a lot of what we're talking about probably isn't things you're aware of. And Americans, for once, we're going to be having a go at someone else's racism. So you're off the hook for this one. Okay, let me put up the history. There we go. Okay, so 1788, European settlement arrives in Australia. Trust me, this is relevant to this tank. And the key problem with this settlement is that it is based on an idea that it was called terra nullius, which it was an empty land. And it was only empty if you didn't acknowledge that the people who were here were human beings. And this would be a problem that we wouldn't actually rectify until 1967. So, big deal. Australia is basically built on, unfortunately, a fiction of white supremacy. And this is going to come to an absolute head in 1942. And is going to be involved in the creation of this tank. So, Rob is in no way responsible for my editorial here. This is purely on me. Okay, in 1851, gold is discovered in Australia, which means a hell of a lot of people suddenly moved to Australia. Amongst those people were a bunch of Chinese, and we murdered a lot of them and sent them home in boxes to give a message to folks back in China not to come here. The headline strap of one of our leading magazines for decades was Australia for the White Man. We're not fooling around with this stuff, unfortunately. Okay, moving on. Australian federated in 1901. The British colonies formed a larger British colony. Australian citizenship, we will get to, didn't exist until the 1950s. Everyone was still a British subject. We just had a local form of government under the British Crown as part of the British Empire. Sometimes referred to it as a dominion. It's all a little hazy because it's just people doing what's convenient at the time. Okay, moving quickly on, we then get to April 1915 and Gallipoli, Australia's involvement in World War I on behalf of the British Empire. Towns all over this country will still have on their town hall the letters for King and Empire. You can't move around this country without coming across this slogan. Okay, then we get to the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, and Australia very literally and very explicitly, the Japanese had got a racial equality clause included in the Treaty of Versailles, which was essentially the settlement for how the world was going to work. Australia did its nana, and demanded to be taken out, threatened to go to the American and the British public on a basically white supremacist argument. And even though it had already been voted in by the conference, they had to remove it without any voting because Australia was literally trading its 60,000 war dead. Our Prime Minister Billy Hughes explicitly said, we're speaking for our 60,000 war dead. We're not having any of this racial equality stuff. Japanese weren't very happy about this. this would come back to bite us in ways to do with tank production. Okay, that then brings us to the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, when the British and the Americans basically said, we do not want to fight a war against each other. They had been in the process of a naval build-up that could have led to that. Japan would have been Britain and Australia's ally in that conflict. And we basically shafted our ally, although I will completely say the sensible thing to do was to not fight a war against the United States. So, good. But the British were trying to build a security settlement in the Western Pacific based around British power and Japanese power. And the raging racism of their Australian colonies kept getting in the way of building this strategic certainty, which would then lead to World War II in the Pacific. Moving on, 1939, Britain declares war. Australia goes with that. We get to June 1940 and the fall of France. The less documented fall was that Britain basically ran out of money in this process in their desperate rearmament and the loss of all the equipment in Dunkirk. Britain was about to become completely bankrupt and insolvent. They did a deal with the Americans to get funding and to be able to keep the war going. This then led, and if you want proof of just how severe this essential surrender was, as in it was essentially a surrender, the Tizard mission happened in September 1940. All of the British technical crown jewels, the jet engines, the radar, the beginnings of the nuclear weapons program. It was called, even at the time in America, the most valuable cargo to ever reach America's shores. All of the scientific expertise of the British Empire just handed over, because that was the deal. That Americans paid the money, we handed over everything that we had that they didn't. Okay. That then led in June 1940 the start of the Sentinel tank project. Told you we'd get to tanks. Thank you for your patience. Under 10 minutes. Okay. Because Australia had no idea where it now stood in the world. The British Empire was functionally dead. It was being propped up by the Americans to keep the war going, but we didn't know where we were going to fit in. And the US did not have the time or patience to figure out what the hell it was going to do with Australia. Which was a problem for Australians sitting out here at the end of the world, particularly as Japan starts coming down.
Japan hadn't started coming down yet, though.
No, it hadn't, but everyone knew it was coming. And then we had Australians were heavily involved in the thick of the fighting, the British Empire fighting in Europe. Operation Compass, where they attacked from Egypt and got a huge way across the desert, capturing hundreds of thousands of Italians. And in a lot of tank warfare. Obviously, we've talked before about the Matildas and the Valentines.
Australia didn't have any tanks in those battles. They only took the captured Italian ones.
And the Bren gun carriers. A lot of Bren gun carriers. Oh. Yeah.
We had scout cars. We didn't even have the universal carriers ourselves then.
I've seen pictures of the 9th Division manoeuvring.
Might have been later, carriers. But we only took scout cars.
Okay. Moving on, December 1941, Pearl Harbor, America, you're in this, hurrah. And this was...
Better late than never.
This was, on the one hand, I'm not going to try and pretend Japan were lovely people in World War II. They were not. But on one level, Japan was kicking down the rotting edifice of white supremacy and white colonialism in the Western Pacific. It's what they did in Vietnam. It's what they did in Malaya. It's what they did in what's now Indonesia. And, of course, the Philippines. And they were very successful. They were also turned out not very good at making deals with the locals and had their own colonial problems, absolutely. And you look at what they did in China. I'm not ignoring that. But it was also very much proving that white people were not inherently superior to other people. And that was a big part of what Japanese success meant in this period. Then we have... The Australia looks to America moment with Prime Minister John Curtin, and the Americans weren't very happy about this, but it was quite important to explain to the Australian people that huge change was coming. From the start of the war, I think 75% of our imports came from Britain, and by the end of the war, 75% of our imports came from the US. And we're a country that imports everything. So it was...
Except machine tools.
We import those.
Well, we tried to. We couldn't. Yeah. Anyway, and that gets around. We'll get around to the Sentinel as well.
So very quickly, I promise we won't go too much longer on this. Fall of Singapore. Darwin gets bombed. The whole Kido Butai, the Japanese carrier fleet, came down to bomb Darwin. February 1942, the same month as the bombing of Darwin, they designate the tank project Sentinel, so it has a name. March of 1942, the Japanese go hunting what's left of the British Navy in these waters in the Indian Ocean raid. Sank an aircraft carrier there. Take a breath. March 1942, MacArthur arrives in Australia. Very important moment in history. He says to Prime Minister John Curtin, you and I will see this through to the end. Not true, John Curtin would die before the end of the war and MacArthur would disappear up in further north before the end of the war. But at the time, it signalled to Australia that America was going to support us in the war, and that was the huge thing.
Should we mention that the White Australia policy kicked in at this point as well? When the black American soldiers were getting off the boat in Townsville, the shore people said, no, you're not allowed in Australia. So to the American soldiers who were coming in to help defend Australia. So that was a bit of a moment of saying, I think we need to get some rules changed for this sort of stuff.
Yeah. So we are acknowledging the absolute raging racism of Australia and its importance in this story that we're going to try and get rid of now, and then we can just talk about tanks later. Okay, folks? Okay, moving on to important stuff in this story. Battle of Midway happens in June 1942. And I'm including the Battle of Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway. They're essentially the same engagement. Literally days apart, same ships involved. And that meant that the power of the Japanese Navy wasn't completely broken, but it largely turned the tide of the war in the Pacific.
Turned it from a defensive war by the Allies to an offensive war, where we were basically stopping the expansion of the Japanese and started pushing back on them and had the strategic advantage.
So then we get to 2 months later, August 1942, production of Sentinel actually begins, the Australian tank. So that just to give you the framing of how this all fits together. This mid-late war chronology, a lot of people get confused on. I get confused on a lot. You need getting the chronology right makes things make a bit more sense. Battle of Milne Bay was fought the same month. This was a Japanese attempt to capture southern Papua New Guinea. It went very badly for them. I would say that when you've only got 1,000 men and you're attacking 8,000 Australians, we're very good in a defensive fight.
And this was the main point for Australia in the fight over the Kokoda Trail, stopping the Japanese advance and, again, taking the strategic initiative away from their offensive capabilities and basically pushing them back to the northern side of Papua New Guinea. And look, there's been a lot of big things said about it. It's as Curtin would say to himself, is that this is where Australia was fighting knee to knee with the American forces. At that stage, there really was majority Australians fighting that battle, but with support from the American forces.
Yeah, so that's Battle of Milne Bay. Now, a couple of months after that is when the Second Battle of El Alamein was fought, with the last Australian division in the European theatre, the 9th Division, playing an absolutely crucial role in grinding advance over 3 days up the middle of the German line and drawing in more and more of Rommel's divisions until the New Zealanders were able to break out around the flank and win the battle. But the 9th Division really covered itself in glory as one of the premier mechanised infantry divisions in the world at the time. Okay, where do we go from that? The Kokoda campaign then ends in November 42, so a couple of months after the end of the Battle of El Alamein. And that was the Japanese trying to advance over a track in New Guinea and basically getting as far as where the Australian artillery could get at them.
And I've seen some lovely photos of people who've walked the Kokoda Trail where you have a 4,000 metre high mountain range and the ridge that you're walking along is about a metre wide. And that's what you're advancing from one mountain to another along this ridge line. And you've got just this drop away down thousands and thousands of metres on either side, and that's what you're fighting along. So that would not have been fun.
Now,
remember, this is jungle, hot, but also at altitude and all sorts of fun stuff.
But also, who was fighting this? Australia had introduced conscription, but it was conditional on not sending the troops overseas. And then we said, we've got these overseas territories that the Japanese are invading through. They're still ours. We can still send the conscripts. So these were low morale, not well-trained or equipped troops who really didn't want to be there and had very good reason to not want to be there. They had been essentially lied to in their service conditions when they were conscripted. They didn't think they were going to be sent overseas, and they ended up in some of the worst conditions and nastiest fighting of the war. And their demeanour was part of what coloured MacArthur's view of Australian soldiers as well. I think things got a bit grumpy in this period. So, January 1943, the last Australian troops have finally returned to Australia with the 9th Division returning. There was an incredible scene when they were on their troop ships and they pulled into harbour at Fremantle. And Gordon Bennett, the general who had run away from Singapore, went down to have a look at them. And because they were the 9th Division, they were the elite troops, they were able to catcall him, shouting, "Where's your division, General Bennett? Where's your division? Have you left them behind, General Bennett?" And a major general was humiliated by the common soldier. Good moment. Pity for the 8th Division that he left behind, though. Okay, in July 43, the tank program was ended. They just said, this is a stupid use of resources. The rest of the Allied war effort was saying, hang on, what we want Australia to do is grow lots of food. If Australia grows lots of food, we can feed all the American troops in the Pacific, we can export food to the UK. Australian manpower is wasted in fighting roles when we can be growing food. And in particular, they were using the railway facilities to make the tanks that they wanted, making railway trains to transport food around.
That was the important thing. We had to stop production of the tanks so we could build more railways, so more trains and railway cars, so that they can move around all the tanks that we were getting from America and the UK, and all the food and troops that were coming into the country as well. Now,
post-war, the Americans are not really wanting to think about us at all, but being forced to. Which led to eventually in 1949, we created Australian citizenship. So we ceased to be British subjects and started being what was in 1949 a new thing of Australian citizens under this attempt to find a new settlement. In 51, 2 years after that, the ANZAC Treaty was signed, which formally created a defence arrangement between Australia and the US.
And New Zealand.
Oh, yeah.
And New Zealand.
And New Zealand, they are the NZ and ANZUS. Now, 3 years after that, in 54, the Australian-American Memorial was unveiled. And I mention that because we literally have a giant American eagle over the head of our defence headquarters.
Now, I'll throw out some personal connection here. One, my dad was on that parade. He just joined the Air Force back then. It was an 18-year-old. No, yeah, as an 18-year-old. And he was on that parade. And it was because the Queen was just coming out as well for that soon after. And here in Canberra, we call it the chook on the stick.
Or Bugs Bunny sometimes.
Bugs Bunny or chook on a stick, yep.
Yeah. Anyway, we will have a picture of that actually later in the show when we talk about the Defence Review. But it was actually quite a big deal, and Richard Nixon came out as Vice President to supervise the construction of it. They dragged the Queen out to cut the ribbon to... It wasn't explained to the Australian people that's what was happening, but very well, much in a formal sense, handing it over saying this is America's now. Okay, then we had 1966. Up until this point, our warships still flew the British Naval Ensign.
Yep.
And then we started deploying ships to Vietnam, and Britain was not a belligerent in the Vietnam War, and started saying, why are our ships with our flag shelling Vietnamese villages? And so we had to create our own flag. 1966, that was how late that happened. A year later, finally, we recognised First Nations Australians after a referendum. Trust me, this is related to what we're talking about. We recognise them as human beings. Yep. No joking. Finally, we acknowledge black people are human and part of our legal system. It's terrifying it took that long. 1973, we formally end the White Australia policy, Rob. Hooray. Not particularly because we wanted to, much more because the Americans told us we had to.
They were having gone through their own...
civil rights movement.
Yep.
Yeah. And just to finish up, very important, March 1986, the Australia Act was passed both in Westminster and here to say that Britain couldn't make laws for Australia. 1986, Rob and I were in high school. We've finally reached that level of independence. And then to finish this story, and I apologise for the length of it, guys. Thank you so much for hanging in. 1992, the Mabo decision of the High Court, which ruled that terra nullius, remember right at the front with European settlement, was not valid, okay? And that the land had been occupied and had belonged to people, and that we now had to reach a new settlement, and we are still in the process of sorting out the ramifications of that.
Yeah. And thank you, John, for all that.
I apologise for the length. I just thought it was really important context for our
I'd like to say
audience.
some hellos to Alan, Tasman, Portland, Lily, Philippine Dreams, Nicholas Jowett, Morgar, The Rejects, Medi, and Philip Stiles. Thank you all for joining us. Yes, Philippine Dreams, the 120ml beer mortar is going down very nicely. John has made us a grolsch. Kolsch. for this one. It's one of his homebrews with hops from a local backyard, and very, very nice.
Thank you, John. If only we'd had another pair of hands, we should have had someone taking a photo as we filled this up from the tap. It was quite a spectacle.
But we should get back on to...
Just talking about tanks.
The tanks. Yeah. The tanks. So the Sentinel, also known as the Australian Cruiser. We have Australian Cruiser versions 1 to 4, plus the Bob Semple and the Schofield tank from our New Zealand counterparts. The AC-1, as John said, was started design in November 1940, and production came out in August. The first 66 production... First production came out in August 1942 and ran through until July 1943, in which 66 tanks were built. There were plans, and we'll get onto the plans. The Sentinel AC-1 weighed 28 tonnes, had a crew of 5. It was 21 feet long, 10 feet wide, and 8 feet high. It had now we'll get on to the cast armour and so forth, but I'll just tell you some numbers for it. So 65mm on the hull, and the turret and the sides and rear had 45mm. It had a 2-pounder gun with 130 rounds. It had 2 303 Vickers, and we'll talk about the water cooling system. And then we had the 3 Cadillac V8 engines in a cloverleaf formation in the back for 330 horsepower. It had horizontal volute spring suspension, and with a range of 240 kilometres and a maximum speed of 48 kilometres per hour. So that was AC-1.
Definitely that's a maximum speed.
No. They said that was the maximum useful speed. They said they could actually get it up to 60 k's an hour, but it would really just wreck the engines and the drivetrain. So they said, no, we're limiting it to this is what you're trained on. This is what you're gonna do.
Are we going to talk about the limits of Australian manufacturing at this point?
No, we'll just go through some stats and figures for. So then they looked at the going for the AC-2. Proposed changes include a suspension in the drive line to make the tank lighter, but Army said no. Then we move on to the AC-3 Thunderbolt, whereby they were fitting the 25-pounder gun for a better explosive round. They could still carried 120 rounds. They dropped the hull machine gun and the operator, so down to a crew of 4. Only 1 pilot model built, but which was kept and is still at the Australian War Memorial and Treloar Centre. So that's basically the big warehouse where they put everything that they can't fit on the main floor.
I think it's very disappointing that this tank doesn't warrant permanent display. But then they would have to explain a lot of things about Australian history that no one wants to talk about. So, yeah.
They ordered 200 of the AC-3 Thunderbolts and had 150 hulls cast when work was terminated. So they had 150 hulls of this tank built up that they said, what are we going to do with these? Well, they just scrapped them. And they were built with the Perrier Cadillac engine for 397 horsepower. It was radial mounted.
And 3 Cadillac engines.
Yep.
Yeah.
but it was better designed than the initial cloverleaf version. It was designed for a larger turret. It was 54 inches rather than the 51-inch turret that they started out with, turret ring, and also designed development for a... They're also looking at doing an AC-3A with a 70-inch turret ring, but they didn't get around to that. Then we'll quickly move on to the AC-4. That was where they decided...
It's not real.
It was real. We have photos. There's one up on the screen.
There's no bridge block on that gun, though.
No. So the AC-4 was... they decided the 25-pounder, short 25-pounder that they mounted in the AC-3 wasn't good enough for... anti-tank capabilities, even though it had a great high explosive round. They said, right, what we want is an anti-tank gun. So they were wanting to put the 17-pounder into the turret of the Sentinel. And
all through this process, there was a constant problem in that they weren't sure if they were designing this thing to be sent to Europe, which would have been hilariously awful, or if they were trying to design it for fighting the Japanese.
Well, I'll get to those in a little bit.
Obviously, but a 17-pounder is a gun you take if you're hunting tigers.
Yeah, not Hargos. Would have been very funny for Hargos.
As the chieftain said, you could have lined up 5 Hargos and got them all with one shot.
Anyway, in order to test out whether or not they could, the turret could handle the recoil of the 17-pounder inside the tank, they fitted two 25-pounders, which we have some lovely photos up behind us, and fired those both simultaneously in order to test out whether it would take it, and it could. So therefore, they said, right, we'll put a 17-pounder in the turret, and away they went. Now, again, this was only experimental. There was only one developed for it as a prototype, and they hadn't enlarged the turret ring, so it wasn't actually the full design features that they would have liked. However, when you're looking at the turret of the tank and you see these two 25-pounders sticking out the front of it, you just think to myself, 40K just loves that idea of the double-decker guns.
We do have it'll come up in the slideshow for those who are watching the video feed.
So and that was our Australian Sentinel tanks. Now I'm going to quickly. We'll come back to. I think we need to do some quick numbers on the Bob Semple. Now, for those...
Okay, this is one moment where you say, we're better than New Zealand.
I have a point to make with that. All right, so the Bob Semple tank, which was in New Zealand. At the same time, all this was happening with the Sentinel. New Zealand was also going through their own process of going, my goodness, the Japanese are coming for us and we have no tank or armour capability whatsoever. So Bob Semple, who was the Minister of Works for New Zealand... said, I'm going to do something about this. And he had a postcard from America about how they had converted tractors into tanks.
There's a Bob Semple on the screen for those on the video feed. Yep.
And said, from this postcard that depicted the transition of the changing of a tractor to a tank, they said, I can do this. And the Minister for Works, with a team of engineers, came up with a design and said, right, we're going to take our D8 Caterpillar tractors, we're going to put some armour on it, we're going to put some guns in it, and we're going to turn it into a tank. So they built them in 1940. It was 25 tons, 14 feet long, 11 feet wide, 12 feet high, very high. It had a crew of 6 to 8. So you had the commander, the driver, 4 machine gunners, and 2 more if you wanted to fit them inside the tank. They could have some fun as well. It had only 8 to 12 mils of armour. Now, you will see it has corrugated iron around the outside, which wasn't the only armour. That was additional armour put on the tank. So, but it was still corrugated iron that they...
it was roofing material.
Yeah, it was. But it was still steel that they could throw on there. It had 6 machine guns, 6 Bren-Light machine guns, a 6-cylinder diesel engine, 127 horsepower, 160k range with a top speed of 24 kilometres an hour. Now, the fun thing was you couldn't change gears on it unless you were going downhill. So otherwise it would stall. So when they were doing recruiting parades showing off their home-built tank... Sorry. I just read something. But anyway, when they were doing the recruiting parades in Auckland, they were basically, the drivers were told, do not try and change gears unless you... otherwise, you might stall it, and then we'll become the laughing stock of Auckland.
So the T-14 of World War II.
Now,
we will talk a lot more about the T-14 in the second half of the episode.
All right. So the top gunner, who had a machine gun below the turret, but above the driver, got to lie on a mattress, so it was very comfortable for them. And there were 2 guns to the front, 1 to the side, 1 to the rear, and 1 in a turret that they eventually got rid of.
I was like, if I'm going to go to war, give me a fighting position that involves laying on a mattress. That's sounding all right.
Every once in a while, you want to sit up type thing, though. All right. They're built with a machine gun turret. They wanted a 37mm anti-tank gun in there, but couldn't get them, so put in another machine gun. Eventually, 3 were built all together, and when they were handed over to the army, they had the turret removed, and the turret didn't have a turret hatch in it. The cupola and the turret didn't have a turret hatch in it either. So,
look, if you got hit by something serious, you're all just going to Valhalla together, aren't you?
The one thing the Bob Semple has that the Sentinel does not is it got deployed overseas.
Did it?
They took the armour off.
To the Cook Islands?
They took the armour off. No, it was somewhere in the South Pacific. They didn't say where. They took the armour off, put a dozer blade on the front of it, and basically it became a tractor with the dozer blade again. But it got deployed, and the Sentinel never did. So there you go, New Zealand. Well done on the cheers to the Bob Semple.
Cheers to the Semple for something better than... It's also important to note that even though we did produce, I think, 65 Sentinels, something like that number, it never received what's called an Australian Army Vehicle Registration Number.
ARN.
Yep. And I actually got in a fight with a historian a few years ago, a very important historian, because I was saying that Bushmaster was the only Australian protected vehicle to be accepted into service. And he said, what about Sentinel? And I said, no registration numbers, not accepted into service, sir. And he grudgingly conceded that point, but he was a bit cranky with me.
Oh, sorry. One last thing is Bob Semple's, the actual New Zealand Minister for Works. His famous quote is, when asked about his tank that he's designed and what it's doing, he says, "I don't see anyone else coming up with better ideas." And that's a fairly valid point of if somebody. But however. I think it was Lloyd Schofield did come up with another idea. I don't think it was Schofield. I don't think it was a better idea, but it was another idea, which was the Schofield tank, which I'll very quickly touch on. Only one was built. It was the another New Zealand design where he was a car salesman and he took a truck and essentially put tracks on the truck, and it also had wheels for it. So it could either be a wheeled vehicle or a tracked vehicle, and only had and put some armour on it and only a machine gun. And again, the army evaluated it and said, yeah, no. But it was sent across to the UK for an idea of see whether or not what they thought of it, and they looked at it and said, well, it's not completely hopeless. It's probably better than a Crusader, but...
it wasn't better than a Crusader. I mean, it looked a lot like a Matilda 1 with the weird slack tracks.
Again, it looked pretty orky to me, I thought, is my thought. So I'm not saying that looks pretty cool.
Particularly, it also had, wheels and tanks that have got wheels.
But it's that way you can do both road and rough terrain.
Sure,
but
and if you put some portholes on the side, the crew can go pew, pew, pew. I mean...
However, once it was over in the UK for evaluation... it somehow seems to have gotten lost over there and assumed scrapped at the end of the war. Now, let's get into some actual discussions. About the Sentinel, John.
Yes. I would want to note, folks are having a high old time in the comments, and we do appreciate your many, many funny jokes about Australia and New Zealand's funny tanks. Well done, everyone.
That's what I was laughing at a number of times.
We're not going to read them out because without context they lose a bit. Okay. One thing that is really interesting here is that during this existential crisis of confidence for the Australian nation as a political project, we said, crap, we're going to need to get some tanks, and no one will sell us tanks because we fundamentally don't even actually exist as a properly constituted nation. It's a bit of a problem. What are we, White Australia, going to do now? And they were able to get designs. Everyone was willing to send them designs. They weren't willing to send them machine tools, and they weren't willing to send them useful parts because everyone was desperately using everything they had.
And we did get one person who actually knew how to build a tank.
Yeah, I think there were a few people involved. There was an expert sent.
Yeah, there was one expert was sent from the UK.
Yeah. And then we said, okay, what are the parts we need to make a tank? And there, I mean, for a start, it was the world's first fully cast tank hull. Australia has always had quite good steel making, and our steel makers really excelled themselves in being able to cast such a complex shape. No one else in the world was game to try it.
We had a lot of iron. We had a lot of coal.
Yep. And we had a lot of...
We still do.
And we also had the advantage of a lot of open space, so we were able to just, dig pits and pour steel into it and wait for it to cool down in ways that other industrial facilities in the world didn't. So we produced these extremely advanced castings. So tick, well done, Australia.
Yeah, whereas the Poms were, the British were only still using welded, weren't even using welded at this stage, they're still using riveted.
Yeah. Look at Cromwell's all riveted together. Yeah, I mean, that's a late war tank. So that was a real achievement that is worthy of celebration. We also had no cannons in Australia and decided we would ask the General Motors Corporation to see if they could build 2-pounders, which, even a Panzer 3 and 4 could be destroyed by a 2-pounder at 450 metres range.
Oh, not even
which
that.
is, well, confidently.
Yeah.
Which is not an unreasonable fighting range. It's not ideal. You want to be able to whack them at a couple of miles if possible, but it's workable, particularly in jungle fighting, definitely workable. And we actually figured out, because we didn't have any nickel. Turns out we have lots of nickel. We didn't know we had nickel back then. And our metallurgists actually figured out how to make a cannon without nickel but using vanadium, which we had lots of. The Australian 2-pounder cannon, if you look in the photos in the slideshow, had a stepped design along the barrel instead of the smoother design of the British ones, which does mean that the Australian Museum of Armour and Artillery, where Rob's seen touching the machine gun, in one of our pictures, is not stepped. So whichever 2-pounder they've put in there, because they've reconstructed theirs, is not an Australian 2-pounder. But that's fine. It's a 2-pounder.
We'll get on to all the different types of the remaining tanks, because there are only 6 remaining Sentinels in the world.
Well, there were only 3, and then they've put different people put another 3
so
together.
There were 3 kept at the end of the war. The rest were all sold off and scrapped. But of those that were sold off and not scrapped, another 3 have been put together from. So, and we'll talk about those.
Yeah. So we got a cannon, and then Australia said, woohoo, we've got 2-pounder cannons. So we just designed everything around having 2-pounder cannons on. We were trying to make 2-pounder anti-aircraft guns. We were so enthusiastic on this cannon that we'd actually figured out how to make. It's also quite terrifying that in their efforts to make the cannon, they searched Australia for high-capacity lathes, and were literally pulling lathes out of scrapyards. They were pulling lathes out of the ground covered in dirt.
From 1859.
Yeah.
1859, where one of them was pulled out of the dirt. The vegetation was pulled off, washed off of it, and said, this will do. Yeah. We can do something with this. And that's what they're using to bore out their barrels.
Yeah. So quite interesting, but also goes to show that the process of deindustrialisation in Australia, which we still talk about a lot in this country, has actually been going a lot longer, because back in the 1850s, we were bringing over the parts to make complex machines, and we had ceased to do that by the 1940s, which is a really interesting point that I hadn't got across until I was researching
one of the things I want to talk about with the lack of machine tools that Australia had. So we didn't have the tools to make the tanks with. So this is why we had the tools to make some railway parts, and because of that, they said, right, we can. This is why the tanks were built in a railway factory.
The UK was building tanks in railway factories in World War II as well, and
they had a lot more. We had one.
Yeah.
Anyway, but a lot of the design choices they were making for the tank was, one, they had to say, we can only do this type of work because we've only got these type of machine tools to be able to do X type of thing, whether it's the cast hull, whether it's the cast turret as well. But the other thing is that they can't monopolize those tools. They didn't. They had to say, okay, we have to make choices whereby we've only got these tools and we can only use them for a limited amount of time, because they have to be used for everything else we're making in the country. And so they had to say, all right, these are the choices we're making when building this tank of keep it simple, has some decent armor on it, has the cast hull, has the cast turret, has the gun that it has. Now, with the 2-pounder, it was designed with a 6-pounder in mind, so they wanted to be able to put a 6-pounder in the turret.
When they started this, the 6-pounder didn't exist as a finished weapon. It was a design that they wanted to move to later, but after Dunkirk, we're just ramping up 2-pounders.
One of the parts of it was that nobody put the order in for a 6-pounder. So once they actually had the idea of, okay, yes, we know what a 2-pounder looks like, and the 6-pounders were around, is that nobody actually said, okay, let's put an order for the 6-pounders in, but nobody actually got around to doing that. So by the time they had the capacity to build the 6-pounders, they already had the capacity to build the 25-pounders, which is why the AC-3 went to a 25-pounder gun rather than the 6-pounder, because they said, well, why put a 6-pounder in when we can put in a 25-pounder? And that was a big step of saying, well, somebody forgot the paperwork for the 6-pounder, so they never ever got them, even though it was designed for that purpose. That's what they really wanted in there, was the 6-pounder gun.
Yeah, I mean, the 25-pounder was a brilliantly versatile weapon, and they're surprisingly small. If you ever see one in person, it would actually surprise you to know that was the 25-pounder. And it was used as basically divisional artillery, and you could wheel it with a Jeep or a universal carrier.
Well, that was the thing. So your normal 25-pounder, which was an anti-tank gun, and
it had an anti-tank supercharged round, but it was mostly an artillery piece.
It was an artillery piece. You're right, but it was they, from the design of the AC-3 Thunderbolt, they figured out how to put on the over the top mounted recoil system, which allowed them to create the short-barreled 25-pounder, which was found to be useful in jungle terrain where you could pull it apart, and rather than having something great big and heavy that was only that could only be towed around by a gun tractor, they could pull it apart, put it on the back of a Jeep or some other, or even in an aircraft, and move it around jungles and very hilly terrain, or even give it to a bunch of soldiers and say, carry this up this hill, which was found very useful in Papua New Guinea because of the jungle terrain. You couldn't get heavy vehicles in, and so they were able to get these short-barreled 25-pounders into places that they couldn't get a normal 25-pounder gun. Even though they were less accurate, there was all sorts of issues with them. You could get them to places where you could, and they can be mounted, set up as a howitzer, so they could get over the very, very steep hills of Papua New Guinea and bring fire upon the enemy from that.
Yeah, the 25-pounder shot's a really interesting weapon, and it's fantastic for us that it's mounted on a tank, so it brings it well within our scope. In that we took an excellent weapon and made it crappier in many ways, but we also made it able to get to where it was needed. And getting the weapon to where it is needed is often more important than it being perfect in every other way. Yeah. That was quite an Australian innovation, the 25-pounder short, and also looks awesome in our tanks, double mounted.
Now, I'm going to get on to some of the things about the tanks we've been talking about in popular culture. Oh? Because guess what, John? Guess who gets mentioned in Girls und Panzer?
What do Girls and Panzer have to say about the Sentinel? Right?
The Sentinel does get a mention in Girls und Panzer.
Did they touch it?
Probably.
Should we talk about it? I think we should. I think now is the time.
Now's the time to talk about it.
Let's talk about it. So, everyone laughs at our hull machine gun in the Australian cruiser. It represents an astounding achievement and a superb weapon in that.
And a design choice.
You have a fully armoured, water-cooled machine gun. You can fire it all day long. You know, the barrel is not going to overheat in a water-cooled machine gun. I think these 303 Vickers guns, as an experiment, they've done
they would just fire and fire and fire and fire. They would not stop. They would just keep on going.
I think the British actually, after World War One, expending excess ammunition, ran something like 250,000 rounds through one of them without a stoppage. Just as long as people keep feeding the belts in it, they will keep firing. And to be able to fully armour it, yes, in the end, it looks like men's parts. Absolutely. Everyone jokes about it. True.
And he made me touch it.
Yeah, and I made Rob touch it.
And he wants to make a T-shirt out of it. I said, nah.
I'm thinking of doing one with just your hand touching it, like, Michelangelo meeting David meeting God, or Adam meeting God.
Now, just to remember, though, there was a second machine gun in the turret, and that was also water-cooled, but because it was in the turret, it did not have to have an appendage sticking out. So there was both there. And again, this was a design choice because the tanks were built for hot environments because they were designed for going to North Africa. That was why a lot of the choices were made. It was saying we're going to be fighting in North Africa for a while, and that's what the experience that they had. And so that's why they were building these tanks to fight in those environments, and Australia, obviously, if required. But when they were looking at it, Japan hadn't entered the war, so they wanted the tank to be able to fight overseas in a hot environment, which is why they had the water-cooled guns. They had a number of ventilation situations within the tank in order to keep it cool. Again, you've got to train them in Australia anyway, so you may as well.
You do see... And it's interesting that this comes out in Bushmaster again. When, on the very rare occasions when Australians design and build a vehicle, we do put a lot of water stowage in. And that's because we're a dry continent. But it's interesting to see that come out, separated by 60 years into quite different vehicles.
All right. Yes, it does get a mention in Girls on Panzer as part of the Koala Forest Academy. However, there is no Bob Semple in that series. However, the Super Heavy Big Bob Bob Semple is available for New Zealand in Hearts of Iron 4 as a build. It's a super heavy tank and takes 2,000 days or something to research for that. War Thunder also brought out a Bob Semple and with its own mission to defend New Zealand as part of a April 1st collaboration.
What were they defending New Zealand against?
The Japanese.
Okay.
Japanese invasion. It's basically you could drive around a bunch of Bob Semples and take on and defend the beaches of New Zealand, which is what it was actually designed for.
I mean, a Semple versus a Hargo is an interesting fight. I'd pay money to watch that.
They did give it the 37mm gun, so it's not just machine guns. And I think they have pretty much looked indestructible from the video I saw of it in the game. It was taking fire but was not dying, so I think it was more of a fun game to play rather than I'm dead and have to respawn type thing. So there you go. And the other big achievement for the Sentinel in the modern media was that while it was never deployed overseas, and basically the project was shelved in 1943, they were brought out and formed up as to form the German forces in the Rats of Tobruk movie of 1944. And so
back in the day when you could make a war movie, and just put anything in tracks out there.
So the director who had 4 years earlier made 40,000 Horsemen as the tribute to the Light Horse Brigade moving through and the Charge of the Light Horse of 1918 and Beersheba. Came up with, did his next movie, which was The Rats of Tobruk, whereby the Sentinels were running around as the German tanks, and the Bluey and Milo and somebody else and some pommy guy were the three main protagonists, and fighting off the Nazis in around Tobruk as they defended that settlement. So that's all I've got for
Engine time.
Oh, the engine.
Okay. So, and the distinctive shape of the rear of the Sentinels, because it had three engines. I mean, what's better than one engine, Rob?
Three engines.
So we had a problem in Australia with attempting a tank design in that we did not have any high-powered engines. We did actually produce the Pratt & Whitney single WASP engine, so the single row engine, which could throw out 600 horsepower, but we were entirely devoting those to aircraft production, particularly the
the other amazing Australian invention at the time with the boomerang, the CAC boomerangs.
Boomerangs didn't use the Pratt & Whitney single row, but the Wirraway did.
Oh, okay. Well, the Wasp and the Scorpion, supposedly were using the...
Yeah, so the Commonwealth Aircraft
we wanted these radial engines, but for the tanks, but they said no.
Yeah, so then what next? And... looking around, now it's important to remember that in World War II, there was no petrol available to the civilian population of Australia, no gasoline for our American audience. And so people were literally buying trailers that they attached to the back of their cars and burning wood or burning coal to get volatiles out of that, and they could run a...
rolling coal.
Run an engine off that. And so at this time, the Cadillac dealerships in Melbourne didn't have a lot of customers because no one had any money and no one wanted to buy a Cadillac in this situation. Fuel economy was becoming very important. And so the Sentinel team went down to the Cadillac dealership and said, would you like to sell us all your Cadillacs? And the Cadillac dealership said, absolutely, we would like to sell you all our Cadillacs. So they bought all these Cadillacs and then they put 3 of them in the back of this tank, and they used a cloverleaf transmission to mate the power of these 3 engines together.
So each one was 110 horsepower because the Army said we want to have at least 350 horsepower, and they said, look, the best we're going to give you is 330 by putting these 3 together. And so they would have 2. It was a 2-in-1 operation, so there was 2 towards the turret at the front of the tank and 1 at the rear. Each one had its own. Was all complete, including a battery. So it was actually quite useful in the idea if one battery was flat, you could get one of the other engines started and then use that.
Well, it had 3 starter motors, and you could clutch them in.
Now, of course, this does mean you have 3 times as much maintenance.
3 points of failure. Yeah.
But it's a civilian engine that there's nothing terribly special about it, and you can, as long as you can get to them, you can sort them out. Then putting it all through the same drivetrain, it was.
Now, this engine arrangement was so terrible, that we invented automatic temperature sensing and fire extinguishment in the engine compartment.
And voltage control for the output of the engines.
Yeah, because we were so terrified of the things catching on fire. And I suspect this is why they never actually were accepted into service, was because there was a constant fear of the engine exploding. But that did lead to another innovation in our automatic fire suppression in the engine compartment when you've got a very volatile engine. And remember, this is intended as a direct counter to the Japanese. The Japanese had moved to diesel engines completely because they did not like what petrol engines did in tanks, so they put it up.
Cuck and goal.
Yeah. Anywho,
all right. Talking about tanks to the left, the 6 to the left. So we've got there is one, as we were talking about before, there's one at the Australian War Memorial Treloar Centre, which is our AC3 with the Thunderbolt. There is one at the Puckapunyal Army Tank Museum, which is an AC1.
Yeah.
Now there's
the Puckapunyal Museum is apparently closed at the moment, and they are reopening as a combined arms warfare museum.
Yeah, but that's not until 24. So we're going to have to look at going down there at maybe some stage and having a look at these things.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. The Australian Armour and Artillery Museum in Cairns. Now, somebody asked John the other week about. Rob mentioned how the Australian Armoured Corps is a more senior corps than the Artillery Corps in Australia, whereby usually your artillery is a more senior corps because artillery has been around for a lot longer than armour. However, now I had to think about it, and I couldn't remember. And I was saying to myself, you know what? Rob from 1995, he would have known this stuff backwards and forwards. And he would
have been really tedious back then.
Yeah. I was. You were there.
Yeah. I disappeared for 3 years to the United Kingdom. Remember, I was getting away from this.
So I just cannot remember why the fact, and I'm assuming it's because the armour came from the cavalry, and cavalry had been around and had a longer corps history. But for the life of me, I could not remember. I looked through for some information about why the Armour Corps was more senior to artillery, but I couldn't find anything useful, and I didn't really give it a lot of thought. So, getting back to tanks, they have 2 tanks, the one AC1 and one AC4, which is a mock-up, but it still looks pretty, and they're showing everything on the outside that they want to show.
But mind you, it's no more of a mock-up than any AC4 ever got to either. It's not like anyone ever actually got a working 17-pounder into an AC4.
No. Bovington Tank Museum has an AC1 as well.
And I would note, Bovington's is on display.
Yes.
Which, come on, Australian War Memorial, what's going on?
Oh, we should mention that the Australian Armour and Artillery Museum, one of theirs was at in the US, was bought by World of Tanks and then provided to the Cairns Museum. So
under terms that no one's entirely sure about, but we can't go into that.
We're not going to go into that. And the last, number 6, was bought by our good mate Clive Palmer, Australian magnate and millionaire, billionaire mining magnate.
Unbelievably obese, toad-like monster, but yeah.
The tank is what he's talking about.
No, I'm talking about Clive. But he would put him next to his tank.
It's
separated the bird.
It's an AC3 mock-up built from parts at the one of Melbourne's museums.
It was quite interesting that I mean Bobbington in the 1940s was just the home of the Armour Corps in the UK and where they did a lot of their design work. And it has since become the Tank Museum. But even then, countries all over the world were sending their reference designs to be part of the collection that was building there. And that was what we did at the end of the war.
Yeah, somebody said, Tasman's just saying, he said saw the Sentinel at the War Memorial years ago. I've heard that one too. I've remember
seen it in the trawler annex.
No. Yeah. Actually, it was outside before the Centurion was placed there, supposedly. But
they used to have a whole tank park and then all the kids kept falling off them. But, yeah.
But so I don't remember it. I quite possibly saw it, but I didn't realise what it was at the time.
I had no idea what the tanks were that I climbed on.
I remember the Centurion climbing on that one because it had the two things at the front.
Okay.
All right. The Sentinel also came with a Bren gun, which would be held inside the turret for use as a anti-aircraft by the commander. So you can mount it on the cupola and go from there. So it wasn't actually fitted with, but it was basically, it had attachments that you could throw a Bren gun in there, had stowage for the ammunition, and the commander, if they were worried about anti-aircraft activities, that they could pop that up and start firing off a few rounds.
Yeah, I mean, every tank's anti-aircraft faculty was all about making sure the plane couldn't come low and slow enough to actually realistically hit you with anything. So they were effective in that they deterred close, slow attack, but they weren't effective in terms of shooting much down.
Production ceased in June of 1943, so we talked about how they could get back to building trains to move all the US tanks coming in. Now, speaking of US tanks and tanks coming into Australia, so the Sentinel was never deployed overseas. It never saw combat, it never saw action, except in the movies. But tanks that were coming in were the M3 Lees, Grants, and the M3 Stewarts, the light, but also the Matilda 2s. Now, I'm wearing the Matilda 2 T-shirt. John is wearing the Valentine T-shirt, which is for our ANZAC Corps situation was Australia decided that we didn't want the M4 Shermans. We were only going to go with the Matildas. And New Zealand decided they didn't want the Shermans or the Matildas. They only wanted the Valentines. So New Zealand chose the Valentines. Australia chose the Matildas, and away we went.
But they're both the 2-pounders.
Yes.
So there you go. It's just a 2-pounder show today.
Australia also had the Australian Experimental Light Tank, which we put together in 1940. It couldn't find any useful photos of that one, and supposedly that is also at the Puckapunyal Army Museum.
Oh, can't wait to get to Pucka. Yeah.
So it's supposedly sitting there. Whether or not it's been restored or whether it's just a rusting shell of a tank, I don't know. So we'll have to have a look and see what we can find.
We were also building, and there's a picture in here of one. We built an enormous number of Bren gun carriers, or universal carriers as they're more correctly termed, throughout the war, and we could actually mount a 2-pounder on one. And if we had actually got to the Defence of Australia situation, a universal carrier with a 2-pounder on it would probably have been a more useful weapon, particularly weighing in at 5 tons, being able to get over all the bridges and things. Obviously less. If it takes return fire, it's going to get hurt. But the Bren gun carrier with the 2-pounders on it would have been a really handy weapon pretty much throughout the war. Yeah.
What else we got? Talked about the short 25-pounder. There was envisions that there was going to be 510 AC4 tanks, Sentinel 4 tanks built, with 110 of those with the 25-pounder, not the Thunderbolt. So these would be with the wider turret ring, and 400 with the 17 pounder. And this was all on the go. The plans were locked in, and when July 43 came around, they said no. So these tanks were designed they had a bigger turret with better engine and weighed 30 tons. And other bits and pieces like torsion bar suspension, gyro stabilizer, hydraulic traverse, and other things to make the tank better. But all these things came to a crashing halt when July 43 came around and said, no, we're just going with the American-British tanks that we were being supplied with. So,
yeah, but I mean, let's face it. All the way through this project, we've kind of touched on it, but let's really get deep into it here. The suspension, we picked up largely a French design because it was close to what we used on the railways, and it was really simple to make. So it was a good choice in that it was simple and we could make it, but we were being forced into lower technical solutions because of our very limited industrial base. The engine was a complete mess. The transmission was an absolute mess. We kept asking the Americans, the British, what they were using, and they were sent over the designs, and we went, we can't make anything that complex.
we don't have the bits to make those.
Yeah. This was an astounding achievement to actually get a moving vehicle.
18 months.
Yeah.
18 months to design and build this tank.
That was an achievement, but it was constantly hampered by the fact that we have very little industry in this country. We had more industry in this country in the 1940s than we do today, but with very little. Tanks are unforgiving beasts in that territory. Having said that, if Japan had invaded, and remember, John Curtin did not know Japan was not going to invade.
No.
Winston Churchill knew Japan wasn't going to invade. Franklin Roosevelt knew Japan wasn't going to invade because they'd cracked the Japanese codes. No one was sharing with Australia the knowledge of what was in those codes. Well, particularly we leaked like crazy. To be extremely frank, the Australian Labor Party was leaking like crazy to the Soviets all through this period. So any signal intelligence could not be shared with Australia. We weren't trustworthy with it. And let's take Labor out of that even. Just Australia was not trusted with that, and with some good reason. Fine. But so Australia did not know that Japan wasn't going to invade and thought it was still a very real possibility until, well after Midway. Even with Midway, it was like, how is this war actually going to go? Are we going to suffer another defeat? Because we suffered a lot of defeats up until Midway. So if Japan had invaded, caveated heavily, it wasn't going to happen, but we didn't know that. This tank would have been 65 of these counterattacking a Japanese beachhead would have done some damage.
If we could get them to the right place. We've got a huge coastline and
But they have to attack somewhere where there's something worth attacking. So
no, they can attack somewhere where there's actually some sort of beachhead. Yeah. And if we can't get these 65 tanks there, like say Perth, if we can't get these tanks there for the next three months because the railways can't hold them, then we're a little bit stuffed.
Sure, but let's go with the best case hypothetical here. If there had been, it's not a best case if Japan invades Australia. If they had invaded, say, just north of Brisbane, and if we had got the tanks up there on the railways, they would have, and those that armoured Vickers machine gun that we all laugh at, that would have caused some havoc, and the cannon was more than capable of dealing with Japanese armour. This would have actually, in that Defence of Australia role, been effective and useful. The crews would have suffered some horrific casualties, but it would actually have been, there were enough of them, they could have been useful in that extreme situation.
I think my final point on the Sentinel was that it was a mediocre outcome, but amazing you managed it at all was, I think, one of the sayings I've heard for it, because of our lack of resources, industry, and capabilities within Australia, that we hadn't even built, we didn't have an automotive industry, which we don't these days either.
We built one and then got rid of it.
Yeah, because it's cheaper to import them from Japan.
Mostly because we don't like unions.
But again, it was an amazing achievement to build this tank, and there were the abilities to the production was going to keep on going, and except that we got US and...
better options became available. Absolutely. Yeah. Glenn, I have been reading your comments. Yes, you are correct that the availability of better tanks was what killed the project as much as anything. But the project was also deeply flawed. And let's briefly touch on the inside ergonomics were appallingly bad. It was a tank built by people who had never built tanks.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, there's two things I want to say that I forgot to say before. One thing we did get for it was that we could get from overseas was the tracks. So we just got the M3 and M4 tracks because a
lot of the lower chassis was based on
America was willing to export those to us because they didn't have the capacity to export tanks to us early, but they could get us the tank tracks early. So that was good. So we actually had some useful tracks because they found the steel tracks that Australia was making weren't as good as they would like.
Yeah, but I mean, remember that when we've been talking a lot about French tanks on this show lately. The French industrial base, which is light years ahead of anything Australia had, was unable to make decent tank tracks in 1939, and which is why they were stuck with these horrible designs that looked like they belonged in 1917. So I mean that was good, but obviously the Americans had more tank tracks than they needed, or they would not have sent us any. So.
No, of course not. Now, I know the chieftain did his videos of the Sentinel. It's bugging here, and complained a lot about the ergonomics inside the tank. On his channel and the comments in his channel on the World of Tanks channel for him, there was a lot of information provided by some people who have a lot of detailed knowledge of the Sentinel, saying, yes, the ergonomics were bad, but they probably weren't as bad as he was finding them. And I printed out a number of their points that they made, and these guys...
This sounds a little tedious.
I know. I'm not going to read any of this. But let me just say, there's a lot more knowledgeable people out there about how many bolts, how many...
No, it had the correct number of rivets.
How many bolts, tracks, bogies, and return rolls, etc. And look, I applaud them for their knowledge. Also want to shout out to Peter Beals and his book, The Fallen Sentinel, about Australian tanks during World War II.
Is that the curator at the Cairns Museum?
That is, yeah. So Peter's book has been out for a while, and I would have loved to have gotten a copy and actually read it, but I haven't, and so I've just can reference it and see what other people have said about it who've actually have read it. So, but thank you, Peter, for writing that. And
yeah. Anyway, but I think it's fair to say the ergonomics were not great, and the layout. For a start, it's a first go. Every country's first go at anything is suboptimal.
Now, would we say the Sentinel was better than the Arjun
as a first go?
Yes. I got to say, 18 months.
It's pretty close.
I think so. Yeah. I think the Arjun will win in a fight.
The Arjun would obliterate the sentence.
But that's not the question.
No. In terms of, India wasn't at war with the Arjun development. The longer you let timelines drag out in development, the more suboptimal parts that have been locked in become more glaringly suboptimal. So I wouldn't want to... it's comparable development processes, but I wouldn't want to try and compare one to the other because the circumstances were so different. But on that note, I think we've got a very special treat for you folks.
We do, because John and I are out of beer at the moment, so we're going to cut across to something we recorded earlier, which I hope you all enjoyed, because we certainly did, and then we'll come back with our... beer review.
Someone was asking, the beer we've been drinking has been a homebrew of mine. It's a Kolsch with Chinook hops and Marisota malt. So there you go. And we're going to Steve Matthew, who's a relatively new viewer of the show and a American tank commander and who spent 4 years in the OPFOR, is going to share some of the wisdom of his time there. So I hope you enjoy that, and you can all hate in the comments on how bad our questions are. So good on you, folks. So So we are joined by one of our listeners, Steve, and you've got a quite fascinating little niche in the tank world in your past, Steve. So can you say hi and tell us a little about what you did in tanks?
Oh, sure. Hi, I'm Steve Matthews. I live in New York now, but I was a tank commander, tank platoon leader, and tank executive officer, tank company commander at Fort Irwin, which is the National Training Center in Southern California. I was on a Sheridan M551 that had plastic hung all over it to sort of look like a Russian T-72. My unit out there is also known as the OPFOR. In those days, it was 163 Armor, and we paired up with 152 Infantry to form a Russian motorized rifle regiment called the 32nd Guards Motorized Rifle Regiment. And different units from all over the US and even overseas sometimes would come to the National Training Center and engage in weeks of simulated battle with us. So that's what I did. I was there for 4 years, from 1989 to 1993, and spent probably more time on tanks than most people have been in wars, to be honest, because one of the lessons I learned was you don't last very long.
So the analogy I was sort of going with was that you're basically Tom Skerritt's role in Top Gun, but for tanks.
I suppose so. I'm not totally familiar with the movie Top Gun. They showed it for free on a loop, I think, in my military days, but I would just glance at pieces of it. I don't think I ever saw the whole thing. But the NTC was set up, the National Training Center was set up in the late 70s, or it started in the late 70s anyway, and it was fully up and running by the early 80s as sort of a land war analog to Red Flag, which was the Air Force version, I believe, of what's shown in Top Gun. So yeah, that's not inaccurate, although I don't know about the Tom Skerritt part.
Well, Tom Skerritt's role in the movie he was an instructor as well as the opposition force. Now, at your time in the at the training center, were you brought in to be an instructor for the tank commanders that were going through, or were you just acting as opposition force?
We were strictly opposition forces. We were kept separate from what we call Blue Force, which was the rotating enemies that would come to visit us. And there was a group of officers called the Observer Controllers, and some NCOs, as I recall, who would work with the Blue Force as we were engaging them. Now, one of the great things about the National Training Center, and I'm just a huge fan, so it'll come through, is that they had what they called the Star Wars room that kept track of everything that happened on the battlefield. So whereas in previous war games that the Army had conducted, going all the way back to probably the early 20th century, it was more of a bang, you're dead type of thing, and then everybody would fight over who shot who first. Whereas we had a setup called MILES, which is the Multiple Integrated Laser Engagement System that allows you to do basically laser tag on tanks, and the tank that gets hit first is inactivated, so its laser never fires. So there was no dispute, and it was all centrally logged, and they could display it on a screen and show exactly what had happened after every battle, which they did as an instructional mechanism.
What were the computers like for back then for trying to review this sort of stuff? Was it any sort of computerized technology with it, or was it still just paper-based?
No, it was totally computerized. The computers were terrible compared to what they are now, clearly, but it was good enough. And in fact, the graphics were very low resolution, but it was, again, good enough.
With the Sheridans you were driving, was it just a commander and a driver, or did you bother having a gunner in it? Or, I mean, I guess with the Miles system, you probably did need a gunner, but
we did. We had gunners. We did not generally carry a loader with us, so that gave us some slack as far as personnel. However, we were also we had the table of organization and equipment of a regular armored battalion, so we had the loaders in our platoons, and we would rotate so that people didn't have to be out there all the time. The gunner was necessary because well, at least I don't know if this is true in a real combat M551, but in the ones we had, the commander didn't really have a working sight. So the gunner had to lay the gun and fire. Now, the commander did have an override joystick, which allowed us to mess around with the gunner or turn the turret in the direction we wanted in general, but we couldn't actually lay it on the target from the commander's position.
With the actual vehicles that you were driving, were the guns actually operational? Would you go out for a range shoot to maintain your own qualifications for firing those tanks, or was it a case of they were just for training purposes and not actually doing any live fire through their life?
The Sheridans that we had been sent to Vietnam at some point. They were very, very old. And they, in fact, one of them that I was on actually had a cracked hull and you could see the road going by underneath, which was pretty amazing when you think about it. I don't know how that happened, but anyway, we ended up sending that to the depot and I guess it got refurbished somehow. The tank, so there were two types of vis mods, visual modifications to the M551. One was to be a tank, a T-72, and the other was to be a BMP. The BMPs would actually have their stubby barrel of the M551 sawn off or cut off somehow. So there'd be a jagged sort of stump sticking out, and then there would be a fake sagger on top of that, and some various hull modifications to make it look longer and more bimpy, I guess. And then the tank one still had the full barrel. So I'm guessing that they could maybe be still employed in some capacity. However, the breech blocks were removed for the Miles laser. So that's a long way of getting to the fact that no, we didn't qualify on the M551s at all. However, our unit did have also M1s that we used to qualify and do the tank gunnery range and all that.
So were your M1s part of your unit, or was you basically borrowed somebody else's for those sort of things?
They were, I'm having trouble remembering now. I believe what happened was when we qualified, we would take M1s that the Blue Force would normally use. So
that's
there were some,
point, yeah.
Yeah, there were some loaner M1s that the Blue Force could take when they came out, which everyone hated. Everyone hated doing because they wouldn't run for the first few days after you got it and stuff like that. They were really trashed.
I guess rather than transporting M1s from all around the country for an exercise, you've got some on base already. So yeah, good point.
There was some of that. There was also some transportation from around the country. Rail cars would show up. Barstow is the town 40 miles south of Fort Irwin. It's a big rail junction, and they would unload lots of vehicles when new units would come. So it was a mixture.
Now, during your time there was the lead up to Gulf War 1 in 91, 92, or December 91, or whatever it was. Was there an increase in training in the 6 weeks or 6 months from the invasion of Kuwait to the Operation Desert Storm, or was it a case of if you're not trained now, you're not going to be trained, so we're not going to try and push too many people through. We're just going to be busy getting everything ready? Do you remember? It was a mixture.
I remember it very well. It was we normally had a very busy demanding schedule, and it got way worse when Saddam attacked Kuwait. I actually got task organized over to the engineers because they were afraid the engineers were all going to get killed at the berm, and they thought they might need new engineers. They ended up, of course, not needing us, but we were frantically training the National Guard units to try to get them ready to go, namely the 48th Brigade from Georgia, and then there was like the 115th from Mississippi or something like that. The post commander at the time, the post commander, General Clark, Wesley Clark, you may have heard of him, basically decided after watching that training, and we worked to train these guys, that they were unqualified to go, and it was politically controversial at the time. The 48th Brigade commander in particular accused the NTC of being biased against the National Guard, which it's probably fair to say we were somewhat, but there were incidents that were pretty horrifying. I watched an entire M1 burn to the ground after the National Guardsman had set a fire in there and fled. it was pretty amazing to see. It burned for days, by the way.
That's interesting because I mean those similar accusations were made in the Missouri exercises in the lead up to World War II, and again in that case were found to be as in the National Guard was not up to scratch and needed more training. It's funny to hear that came around again.
Yeah, well, I can tell you, as someone who was on the inside of that, we really, we really made a tremendous effort to get them certified, and well, it wasn't my decision, but there were people way above me who decided that they never were.
And the funny thing is, you've actually saved their lives by not certifying them if they're not ready to go.
Well, Gulf War I wasn't particularly stressful for the Blue Force side. It certainly could have been, and we were very concerned about facing the Iraqi army at that time. It seems kind of funny to say now after what happened, but we considered them to be
one bad traffic jam as they were going doing the crossways maneuvers with two divisions or however many brigades of tanks it was going across each other. And you snarl that up and you're just one big parking lot. That would not have been it could have all gone bad. But yeah, but it wasn't, and so it didn't, and away we went.
Right.
Look, Steve, I'm really interested in, did you have any signature moves that you, particularly trying to simulate a Red Force? Was there anything out of the ordinary, well, out of the American trading ordinary that you did to try and send some training messages?
Or did you follow the standard Soviet or Eastern Bloc doctrine of mass waves or anything like that, or what was the go?
We really we kept it simple. There was a school that we attended that I think everyone attended it, but anyway, all the leaders attended, called the OPFOR Academy that we went to. It took about a month, I think, when I arrived in December of '89. And we would, to some extent, we already knew Soviet doctrine, but we would really hammer it in and get it fully memorized and understood. And it was very simple. We had 3 different formations: 999, 333, and 111, which was basically column and echelon. You would basically get to the battle area or wherever we anticipated the engagement to occur, in a column, and then deploy to the left and the right and attack and keep attacking. It wasn't that complicated. We won more than 90% of the time in these engagements, which was intentional on the part of the designers of the National Training Center, because it's been noted in many environments that losers learn more than winners, and the whole point was for Blue Force to learn. The reason we won so much, there were, in my opinion, there were 2 big reasons. Number one, we knew the terrain like the back of our hands. Now, Fort Irwin is a huge base. It's bigger than the state of Rhode Island, but we were out there all the time, and we got to know everything. So when we were doing an engagement, we had already done the same thing. Probably, well, the unit had done it 20 or 30 times, regardless of where it was on the post. And each individual had done it at least a few times. So the familiarity with the desert isn't nearly as flat as it looks in California, and there are places you can hide tanks for sure. And we would routinely just appear in places where Blue Force did not expect us to appear. So that's number one. That was probably the bigger of the 2 reasons. But the other big thing that the OPFOR had going for it was that we did it all the time. So even on any terrain, we would have been way better than Blue Force that only actually got out on the tanks maybe once a year or once every couple months at most. We were out 14 days out of 24 every month of the year. Well, every 24-day increment of the year, which is more than 12, obviously. Our schedule was 3 days of preparation, 14 days in the field, 3 days of cleanup, and then a 4-day break. And we just repeated that all year. So, and by the way, a 4-day break over 24 days, in some ways is better than having a short weekend every 7 days, because we were in the middle of the desert in Southern California, and if you wanted to go somewhere, it took a little while, and then you could have a significant amount of time wherever you went, San Diego or Las Vegas or whatever. It was a demanding schedule. Being out in the field 14 days on and off was, but it was such a great training event and such a great opportunity to get to know and work with all the people in the unit. It was really I think it's a really nice way to do it.
Getting back to the Sheridans, was it? Do you think they were chosen because of their high mobility and speed, or or just because they were different from, they had them in stock and they were different from the M1s that were available. What were your thoughts on? Because if any of the M60s that were still lying around wouldn't have had the mobility of the Sheridans.
Well, when I was an engineer platoon leader in the OPFOR, I was an OPFOR engineer platoon leader. I had a CEV, which was an old M60 with the big cannon on it and the block and tackle and all that stuff, and a bulldozer blade and you name it. So there were a few odds and ends in terms of vehicles out there. Oh, and I forgot one of the Vismods was the ZSU 23-402 anti-aircraft.
The big full-barreled gun that we saw.
Yeah,
you see in
they're
Red
all
Dawn.
exactly. They're all Sheridans underneath. Okay, I think you missed one of the reasons why they wanted to use the Sheridan. It's very cheap to maintain. The fact that the engine and transmission are the same as a lot of the buses, and in fact, a lot of our old mechanics who retired or left the Army for some reason did end up going to work for bus companies because they already knew that engine and transmission. Made it very cheap.
That is a really interesting point, and I've never heard anyone say before that the Sheridan actually had a easy to maintain system. So that's good to know.
And a bus and engine and transmission. That is,
we always loved the Matilda for the same reason.
Well, I don't want to say it was easy to maintain. We had a lot of trouble. You know, any tank is difficult to maintain, at least in my experience. But in terms of the cost to the Army of getting the parts and replacing things, it was very low. The other issue is the Sheridan is small, and so you can hang a lot of plastic on the outside and make it look like a real tank, sort of, and make it look like a bimp and all that stuff. So if they had tried to do that with an M60 or an M1, it would have looked ridiculous.
Yeah, and of course the T-72 is, by the rest of the world's main battle tank standards, a very small tank. So you can't start with anything too large and get up to that.
Yeah, I'm about 5'10". I think that's 170 centimeters, and I can't really fit in the T-72. I've tried.
Strange, because the Chieftain fits in the driver's seat, and we've seen him.
Not very well though, Rob.
I was in the commander's hatch. I didn't try the driver's seat. But yeah, I couldn't close the hatch. My head was too high up. So yeah, the Sheridans were really, you had to have a skilled driver, because I think you touched on it in your 551 episode. The flywheel tears. It's an aluminum flywheel, and it tears under enough stress. And many times, Sheridans would just stop when they were trying to go up a hill because this flywheel was destroyed.
Yeah, right. Because I mean, once a flywheel starts to tear, things are going to go bad very quickly. They're not going to improve.
Well, no, once it starts, it's over. You know, it immediately deforms grossly and basically tears in half.
So I've heard stories about the training area where the centre was. Things such as you have to brake for tortoises as they're wandering across the desert, and all sorts of people getting too heated in their M1s because they're not used to the heat and so forth, and passing out from heat stroke and so forth. Are all those stories true, or?
Well, the desert tortoise was a huge issue when I was there. And the problem with the desert tortoise, well, one of the many problems is it looks exactly like a helmet sitting on the ground. You see it, you can see them, and there are things laying around in the desert from 50 years or more of exercises. And yeah, and the other thing about the desert tortoise is if you approach it or disturb it in any way, it does what's called dropping its water, and then it can very easily die of thirst in the coming days or weeks. So yeah, they're a real problem. However, military bases around the US and maybe around the world, for all I know, have issues because they are such a congenial environment for various endangered species, where suburbs destroy all the habitat for these animals, but ranges, despite all the explosives and gunfire and so on, are actually pretty congenial for them. And these bases always end up in trouble because there's some endangered creature that only lives there.
Well, in Australia, it's the kangaroos. So the military bases have nice, well-watered sports fields, and the kangaroos will come down and eat all the grass on there. And so they'll have huge populations of kangaroos on the base, and when they go jumping off onto civilian roads as people are driving past and get hit by it and jump in front of a car and get hit, then the people then ring up the army base and say, your kangaroos hit my car, and I'm putting in an insurance claim against you, because they can see the ball sitting on the rugby field or something like that. So yeah, it is a problem in Australia as well.
One thing I forgot to mention about the Vismod that you might find interesting is that of course, the Sheridan gun tube is way too small to look like a T-72, right? So what they did was they stuck a length of sewer pipe on it, and then they found that the plastic would sag in such a way that the laser didn't make it out the front of the gun, and so they put on some. I don't know if it was due to the heat or not, but But anyway, it's a very long piece of sewer pipe, and it's flexible. So they had this thing called a knee brace that they put on it, which is a length of angle iron with 2 steel rings on either end that they slip over the sewer pipe to keep it more or less rigid, so that the laser would actually make it out of the end of the barrel.
Have any sort of slang name the crews would call that device?
Well, the knee brace. You know what? There was something, and I don't remember what it was. I have a vague memory of a salacious name for it, but I can't remember now. The other thing about the heat, it was, as OPFOR living there, it didn't really bother us that much. I remember one time it got up to, I think I carried a thermometer around with me. I think it got to 123, and that was, of course, not in the sun. And that was pretty crushing. We were kind of all just sitting around wondering when it was going to end. But the one thing that I remember very well was that the tank would stay cool during the day, generally, from the night. And then at night, the tank would be quite hot. So if you were fighting at night, you'd have trouble with the heat, but then it would be cool outside. So the tank is kind of out of phase with the temperature outside, and it almost makes for a comfortable environment. We did have a number of heat exhaustion cases. I would say heat stroke was rare, but heat exhaustion requiring rehydration would occur with some regularity, particularly when we were forced to participate in change of command ceremonies on the base, where we'd all stand there at attention for however long the general wanted to talk. And I remember the sound of helmets and rifles hitting the ground at those a fair amount.
Yeah, I've heard those plenty of times.
Yeah, look, Rob's actually been one of the ones standing at attention. I've been to enough parades watching people passing out, and I'm sure many of our audience can commiserate on that one. Steve, I tried to get an answer on this before, but was there anything that OPFOR sort of developed that gave you an advantage over? You're saying that you generally won the engagements with experience. And is there anything that inexperienced tankers do that you can take advantage of as a simulated tank ace?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of dumb stuff that Blue Force would repeatedly do. They were way too tentative. Like the name of the game, at least for us, was to just hurl ourselves at the enemy and just kill and keep killing till you got to the rear area or died yourself.
Due to the doctrine, was that due to the doctrine you were employing, or was that just your experience and knowledge of what you were doing?
Well, it starts out as a novice. It starts out as just the doctrine you were taught, and then as you experience it, and I've been in, well, I don't know, 500 or something large simulated tank battles. It just seems smart after a little while. You see how it works against the sort of more flexible, tentative American doctrine, and that may be terrain dictated. I mean, it was always fairly open terrain, so maybe those tactics are suited to that. I don't know, but it was obviously very successful. Now, one thing I do have to say though is the winning side of an NTC battle normally has less, 10% or less of its strength remaining. So these are always bloodbaths, and I guess that's more okay on the we were called Krasnovian, by the way. That was the name for
I was
Russian.
that was one of the questions I was going to ask, is because in Australia at the time the opposition force was called the Missourians with an A rather than an I, and as the Soviet bloc, Eastern Bloc, large force, and so when people would run around as the opposition force, that's what they're called. So you were the Krasnovians.
That's right. That's what we were. And then we developed other personalities as a result of getting ready to face the Iraqis and other potential enemies. But the Krasnovian is what I was pretty much the whole time.
Do you have unit patches from those days as the simulated guards rifles?
Yes, I do somewhere. We were at the time, we were the 177th Heavy Armor Brigade, which included 3 battalions, the 163 Armor, the 152 Infantry, and the 177th Forward Support Battalion. And but we had Russian-ish uniforms as well that included a black beret and, the whole getup. I think senior Army officers spend a lot of time thinking about what uniforms they'd like to see people wearing. And we had patches and everything for both sets of outfits. But now the unit has been reflagged as the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, which used to be the one in Fulda Gap, you may recall. But after the European heat was off to some extent, they reflagged the 177th Armor Brigade as the 11th ACR, and they're the OPFOR now. Yeah, I have all kinds of stuff. I have this helmet that I used to wear. This is a Miles device taped to it that's been there for 30 years now.
So the Miles device, that's a receiver for incoming laser shots?
Yeah, these
think laser tag, but much heavier.
Yeah.
Yes. We actually got used to wearing very heavy helmets with all this equipment on them. And then there's a similar thing like this that goes on the tank itself. Big belts that go around the turret, and they can detect the laser. Actually, one time my crew and I were coming up a hill. It had a number associated, I think Hill 780 or something. Anyway, anybody who's been to the NTC knows this hill. And we were surprised by an A-10 on the other side of the hill, the aircraft, the Warhog. Yeah, and his lights were blinking as he came up, and it killed the tank, the commander, the gunner, and the driver. And the gunner couldn't even see out of the tank at the time. So those lasers were flying all over the place. So we could each individually die as well as the tank could die.
Okay, so the A-10 had the Miles system on it, and it was okay. Wow. Okay.
Yes, there were all kinds of vehicles with Miles systems on them. And one time, a fighter bomber was hazing us. Basically, we were sitting there dead. So when your tank dies, you just basically lay around on the deck and wait for the battle to end. And an A-10 flew right to us and then turned 90 degrees up and cooked us with the jet. It was really shockingly hot. Oh, it was kind of scary a little bit, and then he was gone, so it didn't matter. But we felt kind of toasted.
Wow, so it was close. Would have felt close enough to touch.
I don't know. It was just very, very hot. I think my eyes were closed, and I didn't really see what was going on, but I really felt the blast of heat. It's a lot more than a hairdryer. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, wow. Because I mean, I've had a F-18 go over me about 20 meters above, and it felt incredibly close, but I wasn't feeling the jet wash. So, wow. Okay.
No, I've talked to pilots since then who flew at the NTC, and they said that they would do that on purpose.
Yeah. Nice one. So Steve, before we let you go, any last words of advice for aspiring tank commanders?
Well, one time so the Sheridan cupola, commander's cupola and turret are electric, not hydraulic. I guess maybe because of the things you talked about in your 551 episode with the cherry spray or whatever it was called.
Cherry pipping, yeah.
There you go, cherry pipping, yeah. So one time the cupola control box actually started burning. And I was standing in the commander's hatch, and I said, "Oh, I think we might be on fire." And the gunner jumped out of his seat and climbed up my uniform to get out of the tank before me. So my message to aspiring tank commanders, at least in this instance, would be don't say anything if there's a fire. Just get out yourself. Or be big enough that they can't fit past you in the hatch.
I think
extremely good to know.
I think on that note, we might let you go, Steve. That's hilarious.
Well, it was really great to meet you guys, and I love the podcast. So keep up the good work.
We appreciate it.
Back. Thank
Hello,
you, folks.
tank fans.
We gather from the comments that a lot of you who watched that were enjoying it, which is
so did we.
Good.
That was we really enjoyed interviewing Steve. That was pretty cool. It was very interesting to be able to talk to somebody who, as I said, been OPFOR for just before Gulf War 1. That was
Steve did email us after the show to say he had checked, and the current OPFOR uses modified M113s, which would be a little crap in terms of such a big boxy vehicle, but obviously very easy to maintain, lots of parts. There's good reasons.
They can buy lots of parts from Australia because I think we're the only ones still operating them as a fighting force these days.
We will get to that.
Now, John.
Yes.
Beer review. All right. So, for those who don't know, Australia's famous beer is Foster's, and New Zealand's famous beer is Steinlager. But I could find none of those in Australia because, you know what? We don't actually drink that stuff. So what we drink...
New Zealanders don't drink Steinlager that much either.
No. We have a lot of other beers that...
Spates. They drink a lot of Spates.
Tui. Drink a lot of Tui. Great. Lovely. They call them lagers, but they're all ales. But what we are drinking today is Bent Spoke Crankshaft, which has won many awards and was...
It is Australia's favourite IPA, and I literally ran the campaigns to get it voted Australia's favourite IPA.
Now, it's quite possible I've brought this around before and we've drunk it before, but you know what? I was drunk and I can't remember. So
we're doing the Australian Tank. It is an Australian beer. I do need to disclose, as you might have gathered, I have worked for the Bent Spoke Brewing Company. I spent 4 years, 2 years behind the bar, 2 years doing PR and marketing. And I own a Bent Spoke Traveller. I own many Bent Spoke Travellers. This one is engraved to give me free unlimited refills, so I take it down to the brewery and they fill it up for free. So I
just keep an eye out for that one because
I'm disclosing in terms of the review that I have a past and current relationship with the Bent Spoke Brewing Company.
I do enjoy the crankshaft.
One thing that I view as a absolute key difference between Bent Spoke and almost every other brewery you will ever encounter is that the owner, Richard Watkins, is actually a brewer and is still most involved in the day-to-day operations of brewing in the brewery. And that does give it a focus that you do not get in pretty much any other brewery on the actual quality of the beer. And yeah, I mean, Richard drinks a lot of his own product as well, but all in the interests of quality control and the fact he really enjoys it. And to give it, because I have this knowledge and I can share it, it's very interesting having worked very closely with Richard. There are times like when we had a gas leak in the brewery and he could smell the gas leak 20 meters further away from the leak than I could. His senses are unbelievably defined and refined. And that goes into how he perceives the beer and the ingredients and how he makes the beer, and there is a reason why Bent Spoke is that does extremely well, both in judged beer competitions, World Beer Cups and International Beer Awards, and in user voted polls. Now, unfortunately for the international audience, you do not get a lot of Bent Spoke exported. But if you do,
give it a try.
The brewing process is reasonably pedestrian. They do some very interesting things in the dry hopping process that are very innovative. But the finished product is, in this case, Crankshaft is a beautiful West Coast style IPA. It's an orangey colour. It has a nice tight head. Look, it's lacing quite well. Rob, tell us what you think about the toast.
It's one of my go-to beers.
It's a strong one.
It's a strong. I was about to say it's a strong one. So you don't want a more than 2 type thing. It's 1.7. 1.7 standard drinks with a 6.5.
Yeah, something like that. I should know. No, only 5.8.
Only 5.8. So
only 5.8.
Yeah, but look, I'll share my. I didn't realise this until a little while ago. My connection with Ben Spoke is Tracy. She's the sister of one of my childhood friends, and they lived up the road from me. There you go.
Tracy Migraine?
Yeah.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
okay.
no, they lived up 10 houses up, and myself and her brother, played together in primary school for many hours of handball in the front garden and on the front driveway type thing. So it was just one of those things. Oh, yeah, there you go.
Now, we've been running the poll on what people think of the Sentinel.
Ooh, and the numbers are still changing. So we got a 13th vote, certainly.
No one thinks it was a terrible tank, which there are lots of people who would think it's a terrible tank, but no one who's watching this. So there we go. A lot of people, the current leading option at 54% is that it was both a terrible tank and a good effort.
It was a good effort.
And that would be kind of where I would fall back. By the time it was actually possibly entering service in 1942, the world was full of immensely better tanks.
It was also full of immensely worse tanks as well.
Yeah, well,
so I mean, there were plenty of British tanks coming out in 1942 that were absolutely atrocious. And I mean,
42?
Yeah,
Covenanter was in the past by then, and they weren't making Crusaders anymore, thank God. Yeah. Anyway, okay. So that's that. I think the wisdom of no.
Yeah, see, I told you the votes are still going up.
We've had another vote now. It's neck and neck between a good effort and both. So thanks, folks. That's good. Now, so things we're going to discuss in this, hopefully not half of the show, maybe third of the show.
But we do have another beer to do for New Zealand because we don't want to forget our ANZAC brethren. All right, so this is the Australian beer, which is the Crankshaft. As I said, I couldn't get Foster's because we don't actually drink Foster's here in Australia. I did see it about 6 months ago and I said, I should buy some of that because we'll never see it again. And I was right because I don't think we've actually drunk Foster's in Australia since 2001. I think we found a case. And we've mentioned this before.
I think a few years ago I found some giant Foster's cans and bought them just for the sheer irony value. But it's a bit like Americans drinking PBRs. In that
we have drunk PBRs here.
Yeah.
When Andy was here in 2003.
Yeah.
He made us drink PBRs. We go, this is fun.
I mean, it's just macro lager. It's all the same. But not Ben Spoke's Crankshaft. This is an original and different.
Yeah.
Actually, we're drinking this out of our Ben Spoke glasses. So
there you go. I'm glad you know.
So there you go.
Cluster 8 though.
That's a cluster 8 glass.
What do you got?
That's a cluster 8 glass.
Which is a different type of
that's
Ben
an
Spoke
8% beer. We're not. One day. It's putting cans very rarely.
Yeah, the Cornelius is threatening us with martinis if we get him on.
Yeah, he's done himself a disservice there.
You might get an interview rather than an episode.
Yeah. Okay, let us talk about things that are otherwise happening in the world. So as you can see in the slides we've got going, Lazerpig has had views about the T-14 and I mean, it was an amusing episode. Let's talk about that now. We will talk about Ukraine. We'll talk about the Australian Strategic Defence Review because it
came out yesterday and it's all exciting stuff.
I wouldn't say exciting, but it's big.
It's exciting, John.
Yeah. Okay, so Lazerpig and the T-14. So a week after we did our T-14 episode, Lazerpig came out with an enormous spray hating on Russians. And this is part of my biggest problems with it is that it was literally racial vilification in terms of he just wants to hate on Russians in a way that isn't fair. And I think anyone who's an English language native speaker would not want to be tarred by the deeds of our ancestors or even our governments or even what our societies do.
Now, I think this is a point I should need to interject and say sorry to Slovenia for my total misrepresentation of you in the last episode.
The Slovenians were happy to get mentioned. They just weren't happy about what you said about them.
I know. And the hypocrisy and the irony of me talking about, their flag. When I was saying, hang on a second, what's on our flag, John? This great big British thing. So, I have absolutely no idea. I must admit, I'm going to blame the 6 beers that we'd had during the episode and my bad thoughts about it. But, absolutely nothing wrong with the Slovenians, their relationship with anybody else in the world and anything else. It was just me being a bit of an idiot. So apologies to you.
Okay.
Have my heartfelt and unreserved apologies.
Thankfully for the podcast as a whole, I stood up for the honour of Slovenia.
You did, but it was just the hypocrisy and the irony that got me later when I actually had a moment to think about it. It's like, me here, sitting here with a great big Union Jack on the Australian flag. What have I got to say? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I have nothing that I can throw any tar at any other country because of that.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of otherwise sensible people who, particularly British people, who are just wanting to hate on Russians in general. I'm not going to try and defend Putin. Hell no. But, just trying to hate on Russians in general. And I think it's partly a diversionary tactic against the horrible things that British people have done throughout the centuries. But unless you're Irish, pretty much if you're a native English speaker, you do not want to be personally judged on things that your government and society have done historically, because it ain't good. Everyone's done bad things. Yeah, that was a very bad start to that video. And then we're literally getting questions, people saying, I'd heard the T-14 uses the same engine as the Tiger II, which was Lazerpig going off on a rant that because they have a piston system, literally, pistons get arrayed in V's or straight or W's sometimes, and the Tiger II used an X, and the Armata engine uses an X, that they're related, and that then they're not related in any way. And he said some very weird things about the rifled 120 gun on the Challenger being superior because of the rifling, and no, I mean, smoothbore guns have exceeded rifled guns for some time now, which is why the British are moving to a smoothbore gun in the Challenger 3. So Lazerpig was badly off beam in his video, and Red Effects did a masterful video knocking down the things that Lazerpig had done wrong. I'd still say, Lazerpig, we have messaged you. We would love to interview you or have you in the show in any capacity you want. But, apparently you're a bit too big for us. So, hey, that's fine. Anyway, it's an interesting little YouTube fight that's going on, Lazerpig versus others. And Red Effect is a YouTube channel there are people who I would want to be on really sure ground before I argue with them. And the Chieftain's one of them. Like, I do have points that I disagree with the Chieftain on, but I really research them heavily before I have such views. And Red Effect is another one where if he's saying something I disagree with, I will go and check some sources.
He can read stuff in languages we have no idea about and aren't translated. Yeah. And that makes a big difference in whether or not you're getting it from first source or somebody else's thoughts on what might have actually been written there.
Mm. Yeah.
And for Philippine Dreams, no, I'm not tanked. I'm totally tanked.
It says it right. It's in the name of the podcast. Was it Glenn saying, you're drinking too much beer? It's like, do you know what this podcast is about? Anywho, so that's...
The thing is, you can see it now that we're on YouTube, whereas before we weren't.
The can rips were there. We were never leaving anyone in any doubt about what we're up to here. Okay, but... Okay, Tasman, you make a good point, but we will keep going. So, yes, go on.
Are you finished with...
I think so. I mean, the T-14 was... we reached new audiences with our episode, and that's fine. Sorry, this was the big thing. I watched the Lazerpig thing, and I was like, my God, he's got access to information that I've never had access to. And Lazerpig does trail his code a lot that he's worked for some capacity in intelligence services. And he's done some very interesting stuff. But the stuff where I was like, wow, where is this source for this? It's mostly turned out that he was just saying things he'd heard at the pub with some other guys, as far as I can tell, and that turned out to not be completely true. And I like hearing things at the pub, but it does help to go and check the facts sometimes. Hey, I mean, we're drinking a lot of beer and talking about tanks. I'm not having too much of a go. Still love you, Lazerpig. Want you on the show. Good stuff. Okay.
All right. Australian Defence Strategy. New report came out, released to the world yesterday, just before ANZAC Day, to say, you know what? Tanks and armoured vehicles suck. Ships are where it's at. No, missiles are where it's at.
The army is gone.
The army's gone.
I suspect part of it is that the Australian Army's history of committing war crimes when deployed overseas recently might have made the government think that it isn't so keen on doing that sort of deployments.
I disagree. It's just the...
Sorry, I'm talking about the Brereton Review. Feel free to look it up. This is not just me talking out of my ass.
No, it's like... and the only people getting prosecuted for it... Oh, sorry, there is one guy getting prosecuted for it, but mainly...
there's more coming.
Yeah, but it's mainly the whistleblowers who are getting prosecuted for it. Anyway, it's a whole totally different...
I would say persecuted more than prosecuted.
Prosecuted. No.
Yeah, they're being prosecuted as well, but they're being persecuted politically. David McBride and Witness K, people who have actually tried to do legitimate whistleblowing and use the legitimate systems are being crushed by the Australian government through the legal system in ways that are deeply disturbing.
Hugely. And here in the ACT is where they're all getting prosecuted as well. So in our just around the corner from us. But what we're talking about is the...
now, here's the Defence Review, which is on the screen right now, and you will see Bugs Bunny at the top of the
missed it.
Of the graphic. Oh, it'll come back. There's only 3 of them in this one.
We're talking about... So, the previous interviews we've done talked about the new infantry fighting vehicle for...
Al Palazzo, the single most consumed piece of content we've ever produced is our interview with Dr. Albert Palazzo about Australia's infantry fighting vehicle project.
At the time, we were talking about whether it's going to be 450 or 380 tanks for infantry fighting vehicles for Australia. We're now down to 129.
Yeah, we're
129.
It's a battalion.
Yep. It's one battalion of mechanised infantry, and that's all that we're going to get and everybody else can stick with the M113s, which are around from 1960.
Yeah, the M113 is not a viable vehicle on a modern battlefield. It will get people killed.
Yeah, it's not a viable infantry fighting vehicle. It is.
Well, it was never an IFV. It was always an APC, but it remains a useful tractor that is weighed down by armour that is fundamentally useless at this point. You'd be better off pulling the armour off and just using it as a universal carrier.
There we go, universal carriers.
They're back, baby! Also as Alexander Hodges pointed out, we've halved the purchase of the K9 self-propelled howitzers.
Yeah, so we've gone from Australia has had the Urabi self-propelled gun, which was based on the M3.
Going back in the past.
I know, but it's the one self-propelled gun we've actually had.
Which was the 25-pounder.
Which was 25 pounders.
25 pounders.
Mounted in the M3. And that was the only self-propelled gun Australia's ever used. Now, we've now gone to the Korean Redback? Huntsman. Can't remember.
So the Huntsman is the K9, which is the self-propelled artillery. And the Redback, which, as Tasman is asking, we have not decided which IFV we're not buying very many of.
No, that choice is still not going to be
I would say at this point, why have 2 fleets of small fleets of vehicles? Why not just go Boxer for the whole lot?
But we're not... anyway, the point being is that... we've gone from 2 battalions of the self-propelled guns to, regiments because they're artillery, to 1. So that's all. We've got what we've got, and that's going to be it. And so there's not going to be any more of those. Yeah.
But basically, as a result of this review, all projects that aren't buying nuclear submarines are on hold.
Who would have thought committing $368 billion for the next 50 years would mean you have to cut back spending on other things.
But also, here's the good news. We've hired an American admiral to do an urgent review of Australia's surface fleet, as in the Navy surface fleet. And he's going to do a 3-month review and tell us what sort of navy the Americans want. So Australia, as a vassal state of the United States, is alive and well, and at a point in history where we might want to be disengaging and doing our own thing, we are doing the opposite.
We have no choice but in order to... Now, we do need to get through these. So when we get to our New Zealand beers, John.
Yes. Okay.
But yes, we cannot go from... the balance of trade needs to be maintained in order to ensure that our vassalage is. You've got
to pay tribute.
We have to pay tribute. I mean, the feudal system was finally gotten rid of from the Western world in 2006 when the Isle of Guernsey got rid of their rules in order to be able to join the EU.
I thought you were thinking more Treaty of Westphalia, but
no, 2006 I think it was.
Yeah, I mean,
I could be wrong, but it was around then.
Yeah.
It was like vassalage. Yeah. Anyway, so
slavery's making a comeback, man.
And it's not. You're not. If you're an illegal immigrant to the UK, you are not protected.
Which really seems like a law written by sweatshop owners, but yeah. Sorry, we're getting a little away from tanks. Yeah. Okay, so what have we done? Lazerpig is wrong. Australian Defence Review, we are slashing.
But we're buying missiles.
Vehicles.
Buying missiles that can be fired from shore to ship.
Yeah, and at some point, someone is going to have to sort out the targeting solution for all this, because it's all very well to look at Ukraine. Here we go, come back to tanks a bit. It's all very well to look at Ukraine and say, oh, the HIMARS are fantastic. Yes,
and we're buying lots of those.
Save myself from some bad language there. HIMARS are fantastic. HIMARS are fantastic in Ukraine because American intelligence is feeding the Ukrainians the targeting solutions that they need to fire the things. And at this point, we are committing so heavily to being a vassal state of the US, I guess we can assume that whenever we're trying to fire anything, the Americans will give us the targeting data. But, if you're trying to pretend to be an independent nation, this is not entirely adequate.
No. Oh, yeah. And the other one that we're going to do is we're going to cut back on the usage of the military for disaster relief, which during a climate change emergency where the country gets getting flooded or burnt down,
catching on fire,
every other year, we've gutted the ability for the state governments to and or local communities to have preparedness and resilience for those things. The military is the only option for people, a committed workforce with great big trucks to come in and clear away the debris of fires and or floods. They're saying, we can't do that anymore. That's going to be hard.
Look, I do believe that the days when the army could be expected to be just a manpower resource are behind us, because armies these days are fundamentally made up of specialists who should be spending their time in simulators learning more and exciting ways to use their equipment rather than dragging dead cows out of creeks. So it's a case of what is an army for and why do you have an army standing around?
But if you've gutted everything else, all the other emergency services and resiliency to flooding and fires that your state governments had, then they're the last thing you've actually got. Yeah,
look, if I was king of the world, I would actually have a civil defence force as a branch of the Australian Defence Force. And then it could spend 6 weeks a year like a reservist doing warfighting training, and the rest of the year going off dragging cows out of creeks and putting tarps on roofs and building bridges and doing things to deal with bad things that happen. So, but no one's listening to me, and that's fine. But in terms of a defence review, I mean, I did like that they've really gone for impactful projection as a buzzword.
That. Oh, really? I did not see that.
Yeah, because it's like lethality, mobility, protection, impact. So that's a new buzzword. That's exciting. The other one that is a real key theme of it, because I did actually read all 110 pages yesterday, is doctrine of denial is an absolute buzzword, which is about you have your nuclear submarines, because submarines do sea denial. That's kind of the only thing they do. Just buying a lot of missiles, and hopefully we're going to build a lot of missiles. We haven't done very well with that.
That's the other thing.
We've been talking about doing it for a few years now. We haven't actually
But becoming an arms manufacturer, that's something Australia hasn't really done before. So, and the thing is, if we're going to become an arms manufacturer, the only way to afford to be able to be an arms manufacturer is to be able to sell those arms to other countries. And you know what? I don't think the Australian public is really in the idea of selling weapons of destruction to other countries to use. We're happy for it to be built for Australia, but that doesn't make economical sense if you're only building them for Australia. You want to be able to sell them if you actually want to get anything from them. And, well, that will be an interesting discussion when the time comes, when they say, you know what, we're going to build these missiles that can go 150 kilometres, and we're going to start selling them to our good friends in Saudi Arabia.
But, This is where we get to the key point that politicians don't like to think about, let alone talk about, with industrial capacity. Can we assemble missiles in Australia? Sure, we can assemble F-18s in Australia. Can we actually make a significant number of the components? No. Hell no. Are we actually going to invest in building up the industrial base, and which involves, fundamentally, at the moment, every manufacturing in the world involves buying a robot from Germany and buying feedstock from somewhere else, and then putting the two in a room together and walking away. I've done 3D printing. I'm not saying my little 3D printing is industrial production, but it's a case of I buy my robot for my 3D printer, I buy my feedstock from China, and I put the two together, and then I can make a little design and it makes it. But I personally am not making much. And can Australia buy a rocket engine and buy a computer chip from Taiwan and buy the software from someone else, and then bolt the sheet metal together around that? Yeah, we absolutely can. But it's all meaningless, because if world trade breaks down, we can't make a damn thing. And let's take it back to the Sentinel. We literally hit a point trying to make a tank in World War II, 70 plus years ago, where we were pulling lathes out of garbage dumps, literally pulling lathes out of garbage dumps to try and make a cannon, and just buying unneeded, American-made petrol engines out of car yards. That was 70 years ago, and we have not improved our industrial manufacturing base. Taiwan makes the chips, China makes the chemicals. We dig the iron ore and the coal out of the ground and send it over there and to make money. But making missiles, yeah, we can assemble some missiles, fine. But if we actually get into a warfighting situation, we're not going to get the parts we need to make the missiles. And no one is talking about a plan to actually be self-sufficient in manufacturing. And to Australia's credit, post-World War II, we did actually do a lot of strategic assessment and a lot of building industries that we thought we needed. We still have a world-leading pharmaceutical industry, because we said, hey, we need to be able to make morphine and penicillin. Out of that, some significant companies were built. But we also said we're going to build cars because cars give you the manufacturing industrial base to build other military equipment.
Skilled workforce.
Yeah. And, Australian car making, there were some duds along the way, but Fisherman's Bed in Melbourne made some of the best small engines in the world for a very long time. And then, government said, oh, we don't like this unionised workforce. They're a bit bolshy, and so we're going to get rid of this and just buy the engines in. It's all very disappointing and upsetting, but if we were serious about things like shipbuilding, if we were serious about things like submarine building, or even building missiles, then we need to actually invest over a very long period of time in production capacity that no one's actually serious about. So
now, settle that, and we're going to get to our next beer review.
Ooh.
So, for our New
Did anyone
Zealand...
see my tongue stick out when I took my first sip of this a few minutes ago? I was like, ugh, this is not good, Rob.
Hazy Pale Ale. As I said, I couldn't get a Steinlager. It's
Tastes skunked.
it's a Chur beer. So we've had the Chur before.
Chur is one of the best brews in New Zealand, and they're normally extremely good.
And look, I chose something different because I thought, right, we've got an IPA.
Smiles.
We've got an IPA, so I'm going to go for a Hazy Pale Ale. It is a 5.4%, 500 ml can, so it's 1.9 standard drinks. And life is short. Life is too short to be taken seriously all the time. Relax, have a laugh, and just enjoy good beer. But we're here to help. Seriously good beer, seriously fun beer, brought to you by a seriously awesome team, people who put some seriously silly things on a label. Cheers, Team Chair. Now, John, it has a bit of a distinct flavour to it.
Tastes like ass.
Not John's particular flavour, but as I said, we'd already had a Chur.
I'm not a huge fan of hazy pale ales. I know a lot of people are. As someone who brews my own beer, if it's hazy, I'm asking, what have I done wrong? What could I fix to make it less hazy in future? And
there's a distinct. The first taste on the tongue is fine. The aftertaste on the back of the palate goes, yeah, that was a bit strong.
Look, some people like hazy pale ales, and I'm not going to take that away from them. You know, you're allowed your own preferences. They're probably different from mine. That's cool. But I mean, look, it's murky as hell. I mean,
you cannot see through that.
And I know that, okay, you know, the New England IPA and the hazy beer and the London Murk, and yeah, it's a fashion thing and a trend, but it doesn't look like good beer to me. And,
so New Zealand, this is what we think of the Bob Semple and the Schofield tank. We like the Rain Smiles Hazy Pale Ale. We are not a fan, even though it might get deployed somewhere else.
Yeah. I'm not enjoying it. Sorry. I want to really go on the record here, though, that Chur do make a lot of sensational beer. This one, now here's a classic thing that working in a brewery, I've encountered people like, this beer tastes bad, and I will say to them, the beer is not bad. It is not to your taste, and this beer is not to my taste. But I'm not saying the beer is bad, and I know that Chur Brewing are an excellent brewery. So let's be careful on that point. But yeah, I mean, it looks murky, it tastes murky. I'm not a fan. I'm probably not going to finish this glass, which, if you've been part of this podcast for a while, you know, whoa.
Does not happen often. All right, thanks, folks. I think that's going to wrap us up. We're going to
over 2 hours now, so thank you for listening. Thank you for all your comments for the folks on the live stream.
And the votes on the poll. We've ended up with from our 18 votes, we've ended up with 61% saying a good effort for the Sentinel, and 39% saying a terrible tank and a good effort all at the same time for both. So that's where people sit. I thought it was a good effort for the Sentinel because, look, for a country that did not have the capacity to be able to build these things prior to 1940, suddenly, 18 months later, they did. And I think that's a really good idea.
Look, for a country that was literally pulling lathes out of garbage dumps to try and make this, it actually looks tank-like, and the protection was good. The mobility was poor. The firepower was adequate. In a way, it is astoundingly good considering what they were working with. But it's still limited. I would say considering this is a Monday night for most of the world. Monday morning for most of the world that we're talking to. This has been surprisingly successful stream, so thank you folks for watching us.
Yeah.
And look, we will be back, and t-shirts are on redbubble.com. We are probably going to by the time most people see this, we'll drop the prices because Redbubble's basically not giving us any money anymore, so we're going to drop our profit margin off. And curse you, Redbubble, for ruining a good thing for everyone.
But that does mean that you get cheaper T-shirts because we're not getting the money, but you can still get T-shirts.
Yeah, we like people repping our brand. And the other thing I would say is a couple of people have said, how do I get to be part of the live stream, the podcast audience?
And you have to thank our patrons as well.
Oh, oh shit. Yeah, we haven't done that. Damn it. There we go. We've got a ton of patrons at the moment, so this is amazing, Rob. Thank you for reminding me to do that. Jesus. Literally this week, Sheridan had spent all our money, and how are we going to pay for dinner? And Patreon was like, "Oh, you've got $100 in the account." I was like, "Tick!" There it was. Dinner arrived. Having said that, I'm not saying you guys patron accounts are paying for Sheridan's dinner because
it's a small tank and she doesn't eat a lot.
It's more that the expenses of the show are hosting fees and equipment purchases and things are all there, and so yes, thank you enormously to our patrons. You're the wind beneath our wings, so sign up on Patreon if you enjoy what we do, because then we can do more of it and
you can buy John better beer
and think of doing more interesting things. So that's good. Now, in terms of people who are listening on the podcast who want to know what the hell the stream's happening, check us out on YouTube, check us out on Facebook and Twitter, and then you will get the notifications for when the live streams are happening. So that's a thing that you can be part of.
Now, for those who can't see our patrons going across, let's call out our
the top level tier.
Artificer.
Yeah, Artificer. Yes. So we have 4 now. So Chris Pezzett, Cornelius Weber, Per Sikora, and Stamps.
Stamps
in the top tier. And we have the apprentice level tier, which we're not going to try and read out all of them, but we appreciate you all enormously, and you're scrolling on the screen. Jack, just joining us. There you go. Good work, mate. We love you. Vikram, you appear to be subscribed twice as an apprentice, so just check you're not getting charged twice. And Vikram's responsible for us even being on Patreon, so thank you, mate. We really do.
It was good suggestion.
It was a good nudge.
He couldn't get the T-shirts, so he said,
well, the Redbubble shipping fees were outrageous. So gets us back to Redbubble hate.
Anyway, thank you all very much. This was our Anzac Day special episode for the Sentinel tank.
It's gone better than I expected, so yes.
All right. And the poll, no, we've talked about the poll, so thank you all, and take care and look after yourselves, and we'll see you next month.